Leaders of the G7 countries and our President Cyril Ramaphosa are on Biarritz in France for discussions about the global economy and cooperation. But US President Donald Trump has avoided a discussion about climate change, saying he wanted to focus on the global economy instead. Ramaphosa has met with leaders of the G7 and leaders of countries like Senegal, Rwanda, Egypt and Burkina Faso. Our reporter there tonight is Elena Casas. Elena, good evening to you. Why did Trump miss this climate summit? What reason did he give?
Well, the official reason that he gave was that he had meetings with other leaders at the same time, but that doesn't entirely stack up, and he certainly left the impression that he wasn't interested in that climate and biodiversity meeting. The host, French President Emmanuel Macron, though, was keen to insist that his American guest was engaged on the subject of climate change and that the American delegation, his advisors, were in the room at the time. The US has also signed up to pay part of a $20 million scheme to give immediate emergency aid to countries in the Amazon basin, which are, of course, struggling with catastrophic forest fires. And it signed up to a joint charter on biodiversity. So the Americans have signed up to some climate-related initiatives at this summit, but certainly holding the meeting without the American president in the room doesn't send the best signal on how green the US administration is.
Now, obviously, there have been other big discussions. What have been the main issues on the agenda? And I'm presuming that somewhere in there are the difficult, I'll use that word, difficult economic relationship between the US and China.
Absolutely. Well, we've had a number of thorny topics on the agenda, and actually the summit has made perhaps more progress on some of them than might have been expected. Expectations for consensus among the leaders here were very low before this summit came. Now, though, President Trump does seem to have changed the tone of his language on a couple of subjects. On China, he did say that he'd had high-level talks with the Chinese on the phone in recent days, and that he believed they were ready to make a deal. So dialing down the rhetoric, when on Friday, just before he came here, he was saying that he wanted to ramp up tariffs on China even further. Another thorny subject on which he seems to have had a slight change of heart is Iran. The French President Emmanuel Macron, of course, invited Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif here as a surprise guest yesterday. And today, at a joint news conference with President Trump, he suggested that the American president might actually meet President Rouhani of Iran in person in the next few weeks, which would be a huge diplomatic coup if Mr. Macron can pull it off. President Trump said that he wasn't against the idea, that he would consider it if the circumstances were right.
And our President, Cyril Ramaphosa, what discussions has he been having? What discussions has he been a part of? Who's he been meeting?
Well, this morning he was part of that climate discussion with the presidents of other African countries, Egypt, Senegal, Burkina Faso and Rwanda, who are here, because, of course, these climate talks are also hugely important for Africa. And that's something that the South African presidency wanted to emphasise, that international talks to cut carbon emissions and protect biodiversity are also hugely important for African nations. And he also joined the same leaders for talks on the digital economy, on how to move the world into the digital era in a way that's sustainable and in a way that can help iron out income inequalities between different countries.
And then Boris Johnson, this is one of his first forays onto the international stage as the Prime Minister of the UK. I imagine he'll enjoy some of the attention and not enjoy all of it.
I think the new British Prime Minister will be happy overall with his performance at this summit. Of course, he had a bilateral with the US President Donald Trump, after which they were all smiles. President Trump said, "I knew he was the right man for the job and he doesn't need any advice." President Trump, of course, gave Mr. Johnson's predecessor, Theresa May, a fair amount of unsolicited advice about the talks that she was holding with the EU. Mr. Johnson, though, was also managed to upset the EU during this summit by saying he didn't think Britain should be paying its divorce bill, the money owed to the EU, when it leaves, that he didn't think that money was owed. And, of course, the European Union has pushed back hard against that, saying that that's money Britain owes, it's money that it has a legal responsibility to pay, and that the EU wouldn't be signing up to any post-Brexit trade deal unless that money's paid.
How important a summit is this for the French President, Emmanuel Macron? There's a sort of traditional problem of a host of these summits, is they always want it to look like a success. That means they have to talk it up no matter what's happening.
Yes, it does mean that, but I do think we can say that this has been a success for President Macron. The bar, of course, was pretty low. Think of the G7 in Canada last year, which, of course, ended in catastrophe when President Trump walked out, refusing to sign a joint communiqué. The French presidency tried to head off any such disaster at the beginning by saying there would be no joint communiqué to sign. But he does have a number of diplomatic victories. President Macron, he can chalk up here. He's managed to get President Trump on the table talking about tariffs and China, about Iran, even about climate change. On Iran, of course, the US president was asked about the Iranian foreign minister's visit before he came, and he approved that visit. So even though the Americans and the Iranians didn't actually meet each other, it's still an important step forward that Trump was happy to agree that Zarif be here at this summit. And he does seem willing to keep talking on the subject of Iran, and perhaps even, as I was saying, to talk to the Iranians in person, which would be a huge advance.
Elena Casas, our correspondent there in France for us tonight. Thank you very much indeed. Do appreciate it.